Hello and welcome to this episode of The Print Mind Over Matter. We often look at our childhood and say, that was the best period of my life. But a lot of times, the issues that we face as adults, especially in matter of mental wellness, is also something that we can go back and trace in our childhood. So today we have with us psychologist Anjali Mahalke, who's going to talk with me in detail about what are the kind of childhood traumas that people experience and how does childhood trauma affect people well into their adult selves. Hi Anjali, welcome to The Print.
Thank you, Tina.
So Anjali, tell us, so we, just like I just explained, that we often have a lot of issues as adults, and then, when we start therapy or we start talking to people, we often go back and realize that the root of it is in our childhood, the experiences we had while growing up. So could you just tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah. So as soon as we are born, we are surrounded by our parents and our, primary caregivers, grandparents, if we are living in a bigger family. So that's the first sort of conditioning that we go under. What's the society will be like, what the world will be like for us. So, between 0 to 5 years, when we are absolutely with the parents and with the primary caregivers, that's the time where we are shaping the inner world within us. So that's the time we experience all the forms of love, we experience when we grow up as adults, we know there are like different forms of attachment styles. There is insecure attachment style, there is avoidant attachment style, and there is secure attachment styles, which is deeply rooted in our childhood. And how our interaction with our parents, with our school teachers, with our siblings went. And childhood is primarily 95% of our adult behavior shaping time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, since you said, and I understand this, that usually our first relationship is the most important, which is with our primary caregivers, right? So, I wanted to add something that's significant because this comes up a lot now in social media. Thankfully as well, because पहले क्या होता था, लोग इस बारे में बात ही नहीं करते थे कि हम एक बहुत कॉमन ट्रोप हम देखते हैं कि मुझे ऐसी बीवी या ऐसी गर्लफ्रेंड चाहिए जो मेरी मम्मी जैसी हो. द रिवर्स ऑल्सो वर्क्स. सो आप उसके बारे में थोड़ा बताएंगे, लाइक हाउ डज दैट रियली, इज दैट रियली ट्रू? लाइक व्हाई डू वी एक्चुअली इवेंचुअली choose partners, male, female, whatever it is. I'm not saying that it only has to be from the same gender, of course. Whatever gender it is, often we find a lot of the qualities that, are there in our primary caregivers in these partners, good and bad.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Very, very good question, Tina. And the simple rule is of familiarity.
Okay.
So when we are very, very young, we are toddler, and we are seeing our parents act in a certain way. They can be acting in a good or a bad way, but that time we don't have judgment. We only develop judgment after a certain age.
Right.
So if the parent is very, traumatic and dismissive, and they are, let's say a mother is very dismissive of the child, or the father is a very dismissive person for the child's needs, the adult might, when they start finding a partner, they might find somebody who is familiar to their, primary caregivers.
Right.
Just because they found comfort in that insecure attachment style when they were a kid. And it happens in the good way also. If the child is having a secure bond with the parents is very loving, very warm, very caring, and reciprocative of the child's need, eventually that will, that the same thing has to apply there also when the child grows up into an adult and start finding a partner.
Right.
And that's where we are struggling in, the modern dating culture.
Right.
I think there is this psychologist, her name is Tara Brach, American psychologist. She used to say, she calls our society as PTSD society. Okay. So literally everyone has somewhat gone through some trauma. And that's what we most of the time often act out when we are adult. Mostly in intimate relationships, but also in work, in how we identify ourselves and how we shape our, world.
Okay. So coming back, क्योंकि obviously one aspect right now I spoke about modern dating world है. दूसरा aspect that people have is careers, because today more women at least are coming and joining the workforce. Even men are doing jobs that are usually not earlier considered manly enough. So we have a diversification. So, and you just mentioned that sometimes these behaviors that we have, even in our workplace, is shaped by, how the response has been of our parents. So we find that a lot of successful people as well, maybe hamare colleagues or friends who never feel like they are good enough, even though they're doing really well in their careers. So please tell us more about that. So does it come again from a parent who probably never thought that their kid or never said words of encouragement to their child?
It can be a lot of reasons.
Okay.
So basically, the trauma is a big word, but it's not actually an event.
Right.
It's a lot of small things happened over the period of time, which sort of small wounds that happened and were never took care of. So let's say a little child was shamed for having a certain opinion or belittled or put into guilty. Parents, Indian parents say this कि हम तुम्हारे लिए इतना तो कर रहे हैं.
Right.
If the child is not getting certain marks, so always driving them towards perfectionism. Even if they are perfectionists, they never were made to believe in themselves. So even if they achieve, they're always seeking that approval. So that's that's the development of that imposter, what we call it in modern language, imposter syndrome.
Right. Okay. So coming back, like एक career हमने 1 sec, sorry. So एक हमने career की बात करी, एक relationship की बात करी. I also want to know what you think कि while we are in this episode, of course, discussing childhood trauma, do you think that sometimes this word, as a psychologist, would you think that sometimes this word also thrown around very casually as opposed to actually people, going back and dealing with whatever issues? They just use this sometimes as excuse, because I feel like sometimes people like to excuse their bad behavior as childhood trauma instead of it really being the fact. Like instead of choosing to correct that behavior, whether or not, it's actually, the actual cause may not actually be childhood trauma. It's just that you are just rude, let's say. For example. So...
Yeah, so I'll differentiate your question into 2 parts.
Right.
First, while giving a definition of trauma.
Right.
And then second, talking about some people excusing it
right.
in a certain way.
Yeah.
So trauma is basically not just one event. And we are talking about complex trauma.
Right.
Sort of. So trauma it comes from a Greek origin word for wound, which happened a lot of times.
Right.
And which remained unhealed for a longer period of time. So that's trauma. And, let's say a child was bullied for a longer time in their school. So that's trauma. And coming back to the second part of the question, there are people who may excuse, because of this behavior, because I care for you, I can be rude to you, that kind of a thing. But in this regard, one has to take responsibility of, because we are an adult, right? We have to stand up and take responsibility and empathetic responsibility of our actions. Okay, if I had a traumatic background, I don't have to create the cycle of trauma for another person.
Right.
We have to stop somewhere and we have to stop at ourselves and we have to recognize, okay, what is actually triggering me and how do I need to work on it? So creating that safety, that self-regulation is very important while healing with trauma, so that we don't, become traumatic for others.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I have seen, and this is an experience that I had with a friend. In the sense, it's her experience, but the question comes from there. So, she's somebody who had a parent who was struggling with a mental health issue. And then eventually when they went to a psychologist, actually, he's the one who recommended that the whole family actually take up counselling. Now, for the rest of them, it was like very strange, because what they had gone for, it's like, you go for one disease, quote unquote, and you find another. But I feel like that also happens a lot, that as millennials, even Gen Z, people are now slowly taking to the idea that yes, therapy is necessary, and not as just because when things are worse, so you literally can't function. It's not, thankfully, people are not waiting till that. They're taking proactive steps. But how important do you think is that, because we ultimately, if we are saying that this primary relationship with our parent may have shaped us or may have shaped our behavior or our issues, would you say that it's important, at least if possible, for the parents also to have sessions where, they can also figure out, because I have seen a lot of times that it's not like the parents are ill-intentioned, right? It's just they were brought up in a certain way. They did not know any better. They did the same. But there's a generation gap. There's a lot of other things. So how important is it for people to actually, when they are taking therapy, to sit down and have these conversations also with their parent. Not just take therapy, of course, it's important, but have these conversations with your parents, because sometimes they did not really know that they were causing harm, right? So
Yeah, I think it is essential. Not
Right,
just-
okay.
It is essential. It is absolutely required because, there is a saying that a child is raised by the whole village or something
Right.
like that. It
Yeah.
goes. It is absolutely true. It requires so much of effort to raise a healthy, emotionally well-equipped child. And if something has gone wrong, and for most part it definitely goes wrong, to recover from that, we all need to come together in the ecosystem where the child was actually raised.
Right.
So that needs to be addressed, and it may require parents to confronting to the child also that we were not aware how to raise you. It's similarly these kind of conversations always happen with when we have these kind of family therapy sessions, and child also coming to the terms that okay, understanding the fact that okay, parents didn't know how to raise us. They were coming from so and so background. They were coming from three tier cities or from villages. They found a job in 1980s in Delhi or in some Ghaziabad or anywhere, and then they just made a living, raised us. There will be a lot of mistakes.
Right.
They are also human. At the same time, recognizing that parents are also humans. So going into that narrative is absolutely going to be helpful. And the important part is parents coming to the terms that they can ask for forgiveness from their children.
Right.
And also children empathizing with their mistakes and forgiving them. That's the way out of coming together and coming out of that trauma. They say that trauma changes the mind, but so is the healing also changes the mind. So
Okay. So when we look at, like, we've discussed, of course, things like trauma, but let's look at the happy memories,
Yeah.
right? Like all of us have like good memories from school, from, maybe visit to our grandparents' place and all of it. So while we have discussed the traumatic bit of it, how important are these happy memories in shaping an adult as well? क्योंकि हम बुरे behavior या certain issues की बात कर रहे हैं. तो when we are unlocking that, let's say, जब हम अपने या trauma को या experience को assess कर रहे हैं in therapy or sessions, or even for ourselves, not necessarily in therapy, तो ये happy वाले moments कितने important है to look back?
they have this concept in therapy, in psychotherapy, which is about healing the inner child.
Right.
And in that, this is one of the most important things. So happy memories are the resources that we already have within ourselves.
Okay.
When we are having a moment of distress, when we are going through that, let's say PTSD symptoms of our memories and flashbacks or something has triggered us, we can, to self-soothe, to self-regulate ourselves, we can actually access those good memories.
Right.
And sometimes if we are, in the process of healing, we can also look back what made us feel good. When I was a 5-year-old child, I just like to play in the, mud. And
I think there's a lot of us.
And we can create a clay mud, and there are a lot of good examples of play therapy.
Oh, okay.
Yes, so we can go back to those early age experiences, good, happy memories with our parents, if we had any, if we had nicer families, and if we had some friends. So creating those moments, sometimes going to the swings in the park at 11 is also as good enough. If you fear that you will be looked at in the daytime, you can sneak in the night and go back to those memories is definitely going to unlock that part of your child which was sort of seeking to come out.
Right. So there's a word that we often use which is triggered, right? Again, I think sometimes it's also used very loosely, like unlike the actual. But is there in a way, this is just a curious thing. So like I was saying, ki, as adults you realize कि कोई issues hai going back to your childhood. Is there any age range or something where usually these surface the most? Just say, I understand that as teenager we all become like these angsty teenagers, or we become rude, or certain behaviors that come in with the onset of our hormones, right? With puberty. But then obviously you grow adults, and then a lot of these behaviors subside because you realize, okay, it was more like influence of how we're dealing with our own bodies and its growth. So ऐसा कोई age होता है या ऐसा कोई moment होता है जहाँ you begin realizing that there are issues that you need to.
Yeah, Tina, good question again. So when we face trauma or any of the bad experiences that happened to us in the childhood, it had put us in a spot of vulnerability,
Right.
and which we could not overcome on our own. Okay, and that vulnerable situation was created by the primary caregivers, because we were living with the primary caregivers for most part.
Right.
We are talking about them for the most part.
Right.
And when we grow up as adults, puberty is one period where for most part everyone experiences difficulty. But when we grow up as adults, when we have intimate relationships with somebody, that's the time we actually go back to all the experience of childhood. Not in memories, but in feelings and in behaviors. So when we have a very intimate relationship, especially for the first few times when we're having intimate relationships with somebody, when we are opening up to that person,
Right.
how we are acting towards that partner and how we are taking their behavior on us is actually a mirror to our very early childhood experiences with our primary caregivers.
Okay.
Yeah.
So since we've talked about all trauma and then experiences, so how, and you've mentioned that, we need to heal our inner child. So how does that healing process take place?
It's a lengthy and a lifelong process.
Okay.
And inner child is always going to be with us.
Right.
So it's first making peace with that inner child is always looking at us, hearing us.
Okay.
And just remembering that child. Just remembering a 6-year-old Tina and a 7-year-old Anjali. And doing what's best for her and for me, for my little Anjali. And also self-regulation.
Okay.
Self-regulation can be mindfulness, just going on the walks, or whatever suits your nerves. And secondly is going back to the inner resources we created, which we talked about, the play and the good time, good experiences.
Right.
So these could actually help in healing the inner child. Also, creating safe spaces, learning how to have a healthier relationships, learning how to say boundaries. If you were a child and you couldn't say no to a lot of things, learning how to say no.
Okay.
If you were saying a lot of no's, then learning how to say yes. So, and therapy,
Of course.
if people have access to that, so it would be great help.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we've learned a lot about our childhood, I think, today, and our inner child. So again, like Anjali concluded by saying that the most important thing is to make sure that if you have access to therapy, if you have access to counseling, then you should definitely go for it and not wait till you're at the brink to go for therapy. This is not like having an accident and then rushing to the emergency wing of the hospital to take care of it. It starts right at the beginning. Make it a lifestyle, make it a habit of checking up on yourself. It's great that we check up on other people. We love scrolling on Instagram to check up on other people's lives. But I think the first thing is to check up on yourself and address if you're not feeling that great. Thank you for watching. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel and also follow us on our social media handles. Thank you.